HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Three Ordinary Girls, the remarkable story of three Dutch teenagers who became spies, saboteurs, Nazi assassins, and World War II heroes. By Tim Brady. Read by David de Vries. Chapter 1. Years after the Great Depression, Truus Oversteegen recalled the miseries and struggles of those times as if they were still happening outside her window in Haarlem. She remembered standing in long lines with her mother and neighbors, waiting for the government dole to be parsed out. There were more lines outside the factory gates at Hoogovens, the blast furnace manufacturers where laborers waited to find out who might or might not be given work within the plant on any given day. Her parents knew precisely who was to blame for the worldwide woes. It was the capitalists, as they had informed her time and again. The owners of the factories who profited off the sweat of labor. Truus remembered taking her father's hand as a 5-year-old as they marched in demonstrations and protests. She remembered the drums pounding, the red flags fluttering in the breeze. She remembered what it felt like to be surrounded by a sea of grown-up legs and chanting voices. On one indelible occasion, she and her father, Jacob Oversteegen, marched with a wave of protesters through Haarlem until they crashed into a second wave of counter-protesters. These newcomers to the throng were angry men shouting at the group in which she and her father were encircled. "String up the socialists," they called out. "Hang them from the street lamps." Then the mounted police arrived, and suddenly Truus was lifted out of the crowd and onto the back of a horse between a police officer and the saddle horn. As the police officer carried her away, her father disappeared from view, swallowed by the circling fury of protesters and counter-protesters. Disappearing was a thing he did quite often during those days when the family was living on a houseboat in the canal, as many families did in Holland. At the police station, she was given a bowl of porridge, which she was too upset to eat. Finally, her mother, Treintje van der Molen, arrived, and Truus began to feel a bit better. As she and her mother walked home, she looked up at the streetlights, the angry voices from the demonstration, "Hang them from the street lamps," still ringing in her head. She asked her mother if they were socialists. Treintje replied, "Yes, we are socialists," and Truus could hear the fierce pride in her mother's voice. Truus Oversteegen was born in 1923. Her younger sister, Freddie, or Freddie, as she was called by everyone, arrived 2 years later. The girls were thick as thieves growing up, even after their father left the houseboat. In truth, he had never provided much to the family in terms of stability anyway. He was a drinker and a womanizer who contributed little to the family's financial needs, and in fact was likely more of a drain. The breakup of their parents' marriage and subsequent divorce was not something either of the girls remembered as traumatic. In fact, when her father left, Freddie remembered him singing a French farewell song to the family from the bow of the canal boat. The girls would continue to see their father around Haarlem for years to come. Treintje took the girls to live in a flat where they shared a bedroom furnished with straw mattresses that Treintje made herself. It was an impoverished existence, but they were a loving family, and this pulled them through. They loved in particular to make music together. They had a whole string section in the family. Treintje played the mandolin, Truus played the guitar, Freddie played both the ukulele and the zither, and they sang to their own accompaniment. The Oversteegen family was a large one, with a tradition of being active in leftist circles in Haarlem. One uncle, George Oversteegen, an anarchist, had even earned a seat on the Haarlem City Council in the late 1920s. Treintje was also raised with leftist values, and the economic uncertainties of the Great Depression sharpened her critique of the miseries that capitalism visited on the working class. For Treintje, Truus, and Freddie, their political, social, and cultural lives revolved around the family association with leftist causes. The girls were members of the AJC, Arbeiders Jeugdcentrum, a socialist youth movement that emphasized education, physical conditioning, folk dance, music, and camping, all pursued in the context of a working-class atmosphere and socialist structure. When the girls were still young, Treintje gave birth to a brother named Robbie, and the flat they shared became even more crowded. Neither did his addition help in parsing out the government dole, the Dutch welfare stipend, on which the family lived. It amounted to precisely 13 guilders and 75 cents a week, and the rent alone took 3.5 guilders. Inspectors from a state organization called Social Help in Practice would periodically come by to check in the family cupboards and underneath beds just to make sure the Oversteegen girls and their mother and Robbie were not trying to hide a hoard of riches. Fat chance of that. They also wanted to make sure Treintje wasn't entertaining any men in her home. There was none of that, but what she was doing was holding leftist meetings in the apartment, which included men. When the fact that she was hosting gatherings was discovered, it was enough to get the family cut off from the dole. Afterward, they were forced to go to friends and neighbors begging for soup. In desperation, Treintje went down to the welfare office with the girls in tow to demand that the officials rescind their decision and give her and the family back their food stamps and stipend for rent. She yelled, she remonstrated, she refused to leave. Finally, the police were called. When an officer grabbed Treintje to force her out of the office, Truus jumped in and bit him at the same time as Freddie kicked him in the shins. These little girls were not wallflowers. Unfortunately, when they left the government office, they still had no food stamps and no stipend for rent. For the next 6 weeks, they ate brown beans. When she was 14, Truus began working as a domestic for wealthy families in the Haarlem area. It was not work that suited her. Her sense of independence usually overtook her willingness to follow orders. Later she would recall children who were often little tyrants, and lords of the manor who wanted to pinch my buttocks. She took a position with one family who had a villa in the well-to-do Haarlem suburb of Bloemendaal, the bastion of the rich in Holland, Truus called it. Bloemendaal was near the sandy dunes of South Kennemerland, which was the area that ran along the coast of northwestern Netherlands. Truus was to be a live-in servant, but things didn't work out as planned. She spent her very first night there homesick in an attic room thinking of Freddie and Robbie at home. Treintje had packed peppermints and peanut brittle to ease the transition, but they only made Truus feel more homesick. She was awakened the next morning by an unsympathetic German maid named Kate, who greeted her at breakfast with a bowl of watered-down porridge. Truus had no stomach for the gruel, to which Kate said, "Then you will eat nothing," and sent the girl off to wash windows, make beds, and vacuum the house. At one point, Truus took her shoes off to have a cup of coffee. When she was ready to put her shoes back on, she discovered that one of the children of the house had put a thumbtack in the heel. Nice kids. She was then ordered by Kate to empty a chamber pot filled to the brim with the family's evacuations from the previous night. To top off her morning, she had an encounter on the stairs with the master of the house, who stopped Truus on a landing and gave her a long, lascivious look before blatantly trying to grab her crotch. Truus wound up kicking the chamber pot down the staircase in front of the whole family, retrieving her suitcase and racing out of the house back toward home in Haarlem. Her mother told her it was too bad about the money she would have received for the job, but to make sure Truus understood whose side she was on, Treintje quickly added, "I would have done exactly the same." The family was far from sheltered from the political upheavals of Europe in the 1930s. Aside from Treintje's meetings and the girls' participation in socialist youth groups, the girls did things like make dolls for the refugee children of the Spanish Civil War. They were also fully aware of who the Nazis were and who were their sympathizers. In the Netherlands, there was a party known as the NSB, the National Socialist Movement, Nationaal Socialistische Beweging. It was headed by a moon-faced civil engineer named Anton Mussert, who had earned the contempt of Dutch progressives even before his political career began, when he married his mother's sister, his own aunt. While Mussert and the NSB remained a relatively minor force within the Netherlands' political structure during the 1930s, there were other factions in the government who were more than willing to reach out to Nazi Germany to reassure them that Dutch allegiances leaned more right than left. It was even rumored in leftist circles that the Queen's son-in-law, Bernhard, a German prince by birth and newlywed to Princess Juliana, had secret ties to the Nazi Party. Truus and Freddie learned early that it was not enough just to sneer at Mussert. In fact, Treintje's communist leanings placed her and her daughters in the thick of the struggle. She not only kept the girls well informed of what was happening in Germany and elsewhere, but she also brought anti-fascist refugees into the house through her membership in a communist relief organization called Red Aid. As early as 1934, Treintje welcomed German leftists fleeing from Hitler's oppressions into their home. There would be a late-night knock on the door, and a Dutch neighbor from party meetings would be there with one or two shivering souls on their way to asylum in England. Treintje would let them in for an overnight, and the next day the Dutch neighbor would be back to take them on their next leg toward freedom. Early on, the girls learned to keep quiet about the visitors, and to keep quiet about the activities their mother was involved in. Even before the Germans came to occupy their country, Truus and Freddie knew that talking was dangerous. They knew what the Nazis were and what they were capable of. They knew the meaning of betrayal. As Hitler and the Germans flexed their muscles through Europe from the mid to the late 1930s, remilitarizing the Rhineland, establishing the Anschluss in Austria, annexing the Sudetenland, grabbing Bohemia and Moravia from Czechoslovakia with no signs of stopping and appeased all the while by Western Europe, it became more and more apparent that a Second World War was imminent. But the Dutch people, who had been spared the horrors of the First World War by the simple expediency of staying neutral during the bloodbath, remained largely convinced or deluded into thinking that the same thing would hold true during the next conflict. The country even served as the exile home of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was spending his final days in relative harmlessness, chopping wood on an estate outside the town of Doorn in Utrecht. Maybe that was all these fierce tyrants from Germany wanted from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, a place to contemplate fate and furiously work up an old man's sweat. On September 1, 1939, 2 days past Truus's 16th birthday, Germany invaded Poland. For Great Britain and France, there were no more cards to play, no more attempts to appease Hitler. The newsreels down at the theater off the Grote Markt in Haarlem showed footage of the German people triumphantly hailing Hitler, while the newspapers told of Wehrmacht tanks sweeping across the Polish landscape as the Polish cavalry charged on horseback into the deadly fire. The Dutch government had ordered a mobilization of its armed forces just a few days before the German blitzkrieg swept through Poland, but it hedged its bets by declaring the intention to stay neutral in the coming conflict after the British and French declared war. Despite the government's best intentions for the country, the war had an immediate and harsh economic impact on the Netherlands. A British blockade of Dutch ports effectively ended trade between Germany and the Netherlands. It also underscored the value of the Dutch coastline to Hitler and the Third Reich, further reducing the likelihood that the Kingdom of the Netherlands would be able to remain neutral throughout the coming war, as they had during the First World War. To say that the Dutch military was unprepared to defend itself against the German war machine would be a gross understatement. While nations across Europe had been building military forces over the past few years to try to keep some pace against the money being poured into the Wehrmacht by Germany, the Dutch still didn't possess a single tank in its entire arsenal until 1940. Military spending, which was actually doubled in 1938, still represented just 4% of federal spending in the Netherlands compared to 25% in Germany. The only expansion of its army between the wars was the creation of 2 regiments of bicyclists, one of which included a military band with specially designed handlebars that could be steered while playing an instrument. The regimental motto was "Swift and nimble, composed and dignified." The nation's chief defense strategy was one that had been in existence since the 17th century. It involved conceding territory to the northeast and south in the Netherlands, while at the same time flooding the lowest-lying areas of the country, those already beneath sea level and including many of Holland's major cities, including Dordrecht, Utrecht, Haarlem, and Amsterdam, along a line running from the northwest near Lake Yssel, southwest to the Amstel and Rhine rivers. The Germans could enter the country, but would immediately be stymied by sluggish water, too shallow for boats and too muckish for foot or vehicle travel. The cities inside the line were fortified by newly built bunkers and fortresses, financed by the slight increase in the country's defenses spending. Life for the Oversteegen family in Haarlem went on as usual, with the added intensity of war drums looming on the horizon. One day, Treintje asked Truus and Freddie to pick up a boy and girl from another safe house in Haarlem and bring them back to their apartment for an overnight stay. The girls, who had been squabbling with each other just before the request, felt put upon and rebelled at the idea of taking more visitors into their cramped quarters. Treintje was having none of it. These children had escaped from Germany without their parents, she told them. They were lonely, frightened, and had no idea what their future held. How could Truus and Freddie be so selfish, petty, and self-pitying? The girls, hardly more than children themselves, were abashed, and did as their mother asked. Truus took a house-cleaning job with a family of Jewish immigrants from Germany who owned a furniture store in town. They had left everything behind to escape the Nazis. One day she overheard a visitor to the family from Germany urging them to continue on to America, sure that Hitler would soon come to the Netherlands as he had Poland. Truus wondered if her own family should go to America too. That night she asked her mother about this. War was coming. Couldn't they find a way? "You need money for that," Treintje reminded her daughter. "And what would we do there anyway?" Truus had no answer for that. On May 10, 1940, the Oversteegen family, along with everyone else in the neighborhood, awoke to the ominous droning of planes overhead. Everyone rushed out into the street in their pajamas to look up at the planes passing over Haarlem. The day was gorgeous and clear, the skies a crystal blue. It seemed impossible, unreal, that those planes were actually carrying bombs, and that Dutch anti-aircraft weapons were now shooting at the German bombers. Then one of the gray-green bombers started to smoke. Moments later it was falling out of the sky, the green cross near its tail twirling as it dropped. There was nothing unreal about the shudder of the earth following the crash and the explosion of the plane as it burst into flames. Someone put a radio in a windowsill and cranked up the volume. The broadcaster was transmitting what sounded like gibberish over the airwaves. Everyone would later understand the nonsense to be coded messages, probably directed across the English Channel, but at that moment it added to their confusion. Finally, a government official came on with the actual news in understandable Dutch. They were under attack by the Germans. The Germans were invading the Kingdom of the Netherlands on multiple fronts. A woman cried out, "Oh, Jesus, where can we go now?" And all around her, neighbors stood clutching one another, trying to comprehend what this all meant for them. Truus, Freddie, and Treintje were also trying to make sense of all that was happening. It was at this moment that the girl's brother, Robbie, out of simple nervous energy, started to sing the song Naar de Bollen, a popular song by the famed cabaret Dutch singer Louis Davids. Eventually, everyone went back into their homes to listen to their own radios and track news of the invasion in their living rooms. Treintje quickly swung into action. It was time for all of her left-wing books, her paintings, her photos of socialist gatherings, her pamphlets, leaflets, anything that connected her with the cause, to go into the stove, and now. The four of them spent most of the day gathering and burning any tangible evidence of their leftist past. There could be no visible hint of their politics if the Nazis knocked on the door. Hitler had authorized the invasion of the Netherlands only the day before. Up to the moment of the invasion, many Dutch people remained so sanguine about the possibility of avoiding a German attack that one newspaper headlined its morning edition on the day of the invasion, "Tensions diffused, expected events not to occur." Soldiers in the Royal Netherlands Army fought valiantly, including those bicycle regiments, which actually performed as well as could be expected. But German firepower would quickly prove overwhelming. Trying to circumvent the anticipated flooding of Dutch lowlands, the Germans landed paratroopers at a number of airports and at The Hague, home of the Dutch government. They were challenged by Dutch forces wherever they appeared, and the fighting between the armies was hot. Many more German troops were pressing from the south and east, however, through the provinces of Limburg and Noord-Brabant. The Germans also employed trickery in the invasion. Near the Dutch border with Germany, a group of Wehrmacht soldiers dressed in the uniforms of Dutch military police strolled across a bridge with a contingent of German prisoners of war. Once they'd passed the real Dutch defenders guarding the crossing, they immediately turned on them and attacked. Some of the paratroopers were also said to be posing as Dutch forces, and to counter the threat, soldiers of the Royal Netherlands Army near The Hague started to challenge strangers that they encountered by asking them to pronounce the name of a local seaside town, Scheveningen, which was notoriously difficult for Germans to get right. The Dutch desperately needed assistance from Allied forces, but both Great Britain and France had problems of their own dealing with Germany, and no help would be forthcoming. In addition, German forces focused on cutting off any possibility of Allied aid through Belgium in the west by concentrating units near The Hague around the area that separated Zuid, South Holland, and its provincial capital of Rotterdam from Noord-Holland and Amsterdam. In aiming at The Hague, the Germans were also clearly maneuvering to capture the Queen and the Dutch government. Their efforts were foiled, however, when 2 days into the invasion on May 12, Crown Princess Juliana, her children, and her husband Bernhard all fled to England on a British destroyer. The commander-in-chief of Dutch armed forces advised Queen Wilhelmina that he could no longer guarantee her safety in the Netherlands, and the next day, May 13, 1940, she too fled to England. The rest of the government followed suit later that day. When she arrived in London, the Queen issued a defiant statement, telling her people to keep on struggling and that she could best work for the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the safe arms of the British. From here, she could fight against Nazi tyranny as well as guard against threats to the Dutch East Indies, the colonial engine of the national economy, which was already being pressured by the Axis power lurking in the Far East, Japan. Wilhelmina declared London to be the new seat of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, to be supported by a new government in exile. The speed with which all of this happened left most of the Dutch population with their heads spinning. The Oversteegen family, hardly sympathetic to the royal family and the conservative government to begin with, felt misled by the reassuring pronouncements they'd heard just prior to the invasion. Now, just 4 days after the attack, they were being told that their queen and government had abandoned them to the Nazis and were safe in London. Worse news was coming the next day. The Dutch continued to fight even after the government left The Hague, but they were already squeezed into the area known as Fortress Holland, centered around the large cities in the western part of the nation. By Tuesday, May 14, Germany was threatening to bomb the city of Rotterdam if Dutch authorities persisted in defending what was left of the nation. The Nazis set a 3 p.m. deadline on the afternoon of the 14th for the Royal Army of the Netherlands to surrender, terms to which the Dutch commander agreed. German bombers, however, were already in the air, prepared to carry out the attack when the agreement was reached. German radio operators ordered the strike to be aborted, but they were only partially successful in turning the wave of bombers from the target. 54 Stuka planes unloaded their bombs on the city, and a rain of death and destruction swept over Rotterdam. According to the Dutch historian Lou de Jong, fires started here, there, and everywhere, and in less than 20 minutes, more than 2 square miles of city blocks were turned into a blazing hell of death and devastation. Hundreds of people were killed with the impact of the bombs. Hundreds more died in the devastating smoke and fires. Thousands upon thousands were left homeless and without shelter. All roads out of Rotterdam were jammed into impassable human dams packed solid by the press of desperate refugees trying to escape the burning city. Some of the first German bombs landed on the city's water main, which subsequently made fire hydrants and fire crews across Rotterdam useless against the spread of flames. The city zoo was destroyed by fire, setting free scores of exotic animals into the chaotic streets of the burning city. There were reports of patients in the upper floors of a burning Rotterdam City Hospital choosing to jump to their deaths rather than face the searing flames spreading toward them. The fires were still burning the next day when the terms of the capitulation of Holland to German forces was signed. There were still Dutch forces fighting in Zeeland, in the far northern corner of the country, but theirs was a lonely battle that would not last long. 9 million Netherlanders were suddenly under the heel of the Reichstag boot. In the words of de Jong, in 5 days, a struggle which had been expected to last 5 months had come to its end. The full meaning of that change would come in time, but some of the dreaded consequences of Nazi rule were immediately anticipated, particularly in Amsterdam, which housed the largest portion of Jewish refugees from Germany in the Netherlands. The number of suicides on that day when Hitler and his minions occupied the country was so large that the Amsterdam City Department of Health was not capable of gathering all the bodies in its ambulances. They hired trucks and drivers to help. The first act of the new regime in the Netherlands was to free all of the NSB members who had been jailed by the supplanted administration. These were the same right-wing thugs, including Anton Mussert, who had been imprisoned by the Dutch government prior to the invasion for their collaborations with the Germans. They were now free to puff out their chests and strut around the streets of Amsterdam, Haarlem, The Hague, and the still smoldering ruins of Rotterdam like preening cocks. The final toll of death and destruction in Rotterdam was 900 dead and more than 10,000 homeless, along with the destruction of 31 department stores, 13 banks, 19 consulates, 2 museums, 4 churches, 22 movie theaters, and 517 cafes. The city was essentially leveled. In Great Britain, which was about to face its own long siege of bombing from the German Luftwaffe, Rotterdam represented the supreme destruction that Germany was capable of inflicting on any civilian population in Europe. On May 15, Germany's 207th Division entered Amsterdam from the southeast side of the city, crossed the Amstel River, and then continued west toward Haarlem. It wasn't until the following day in Amsterdam that the German Wehrmacht made its grand entrance into the city, motoring in like the conquering nation it wanted the world to see, complete with 2 divisions of panzer tanks, endless motorcycles, trucks, and half-tracks hauling anti-aircraft weaponry. A squad of Mercedes-Benz brought the German officer corps and deposited them at the finest hotels in the city, where they immediately commandeered all of the best rooms. Meanwhile, in Haarlem, Truus Oversteegen went down to the Grote Markt to witness the arrival of the Germans. There, in the center of the city, by the Grote Kerk, by the statue of Laurens Janszoon Koster, the 14th-century Haarlem citizen, said by every good Haarlemmer to have created and printed with movable type before Gutenberg, a long convoy of German tanks and military vehicles rumbled and thundered up the pavers of Grote Houtstraat. A number of Dutch fascists, the NSB'ers, were there to greet them with Sieg Heils and the accompanying stiff-armed salute. The women from that crowd threw flowers at the tanks, and one of the belching, treaded monsters stopped just in front of Truus. A German soldier opened the hatch at the top of the tank to look out, and as he did, she noticed that the tank had blood in its tracks. The red stain didn't go unnoticed by other Dutch patriots in the crowd either. One of them yelled, "Murderers!" and others picked up the chant until the police arrived to disperse the crowd. Truus went home in a foul mood. "The scum is here," she said to her family and their 2 young Jewish visitors when she arrived at the dinner table. Chapter 2. Haarlem, an ancient and proud city, grew up between the river Sparne and the coastal dunes along the North Sea beginning around the 10th century A.D. It blossomed into one of Holland's major cities during medieval times, rivaling Dordrecht, Delft, Rotterdam, Leiden, and Amsterdam as a center of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?